Chris and Chris Talk Movies.
Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Chris Ferry, and of course, this is my co-host.
My name is Chris Huddleston.
And today we are both very excited to be talking to you about the collaboration between Jim Henson and David Bowie and George Lucas. What year was it?
Was George Lucas involved? 1986.
I thought so, yeah.
Is that not Willow?
Well, we'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
Anyway, today we're going to be talking about Legend. Do you have a synopsis for us, Mr. Huddleston?
I do. 16-year-old Sarah is
wait, not Legend. I'm sorry.
Labyrinth. Yeah, I didn't even catch that.
Was kicked in the head by a donkey. So bear with me. Labyrinth, baby. Do you have a synopsis for us, Mr. Huddleston?
I do. 16-year-old Sarah is given 13 hours to solve a labyrinth and rescue her baby brother, Toby. That was weird wording. Weird way I said that.
We're off to a
when
great...
her wish for him to be taken away is granted by the Goblin King, Jareth. And it stars David Bowie, Jennifer Connelly, and a bunch of Muppets. And it was directed by Jim Henson. And now I'm curious as to George Lucas's involvement.
I think so. Am I insane?
All right, we'll have to look into that while we're talking. So, okay. So we both had seen this in the past. What did you think of it? Have you seen this a bunch of times? Is this like a beloved from your youth film?
I haven't seen it. Yeah, it was produced by George Lucas.
Oh, okay. All right. I did not know.
I have I probably haven't seen it since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Relatively kid. I wasn't like, we weren't young kids when this came out, but
13.
Yeah, but we were still, young.
Yeah.
And I think at the time, Henson for me was Sesame Street and then the Muppet Show. And the Dark Crystal fell a little prey to this too. Like, it all looked like Henson to me, and some of the genius of the design and the inventiveness of the design was eclipsed a little bit, is that I kept wanting Muppets that I already knew somehow. I didn't want these strange Muppets. I couldn't unsee the Muppet for the film.
You're talking about when you were a kid?
When I was watching it when this first came out, I'm like, oh, they're not doing the Muppets anymore. Now they're doing this other stuff, right? But as I revisit it now with enough time, you can't deny the imagination, just the stunning visual inventiveness and creativity in this. I mean, I think this movie, it's not perfect. It drags a little bit, frankly, for me. But visually spectacular, absolutely. And I think it picks up I got more invested in it as we went along. It was a little bit of a slow start for me in terms of caring. Jennifer Connelly plays the lead, and she is spoiled and very self-absorbed. I mean, that's all part of the story, but she's difficult to like in the beginning. And she has a baby brother that's crying, and it's really something she doesn't want to deal with. And as a parent, I'm like, will you please soothe that baby? Like, I can't watch this baby in distress. All you have to do is pick him up and like comfort him. That baby was breaking my heart when he's standing in his crib, just, oh, film crew, please don't torment a baby. But yeah, what did you think?
Yeah, so I saw this in the theater. I went with my sister, who is 6 years younger than me. So I was 13, I guess, and she would have been 7. And I remember, I think I would agree with a lot of what you said there. I think, like, I loved Sesame Street and the Muppets and Fraggle Rock as a kid. And, then Henson hit this fantasy period where it was like everything it seemed that he was doing was this fantasy type of thing. And I think even as a kid, I always wanted to like the stuff. I wanted to like it more than I did. The Dark Crystal, I always thought was pretty cool. I think that was maybe like 82, and I found it pretty scary, as a child. It was the Skeksis, they were pretty frightening. But when I saw this, and I don't think I had ever caught this on television or anything like that since 1986. And I think my sister was really into this, but I think at 13 I was probably a little bit too old. You know what I mean? At that time. And Henson was definitely a genius. And I would say, like you, this is the particularly the design of the creatures and everything is great, and all the puppetry and all that is, as you would expect from a Henson production, is really, really good. This, to me, suffered a little bit from the same problems I had with Time Bandits when we watched it a few months ago. That, I don't know if it's just our modern way of that our attention spans have been eroded so much, but very much like Time Bandits, there was a lot of this where I felt like, okay, let's go to the next scene. This is taking too long. I thought, like you, I thought it was funny in the beginning. I wasn't really certain at the beginning if you are supposed to, like, if you're a child watching this, because this is very much a children's film. I would say, like, up to about 10, this would be a pretty good age. But as a child, are you supposed to are you supposed to empathize with her? Are you supposed to think like, oh, her parents are so mean? And it's like 30 seconds of, hey, do you think you could come home and watch your brother while we go out? And it's like, you go out all the time, and it's just like, it's just immediately you're just like, wow, she's a brat. It's not like, the setup sometimes in these movies where it's like, oh, the wicked stepmother, and the presumably the stepmother actually says in this, oh, I'm the wicked stepmother, but the parents didn't seem that bad.
One thing I noted is they want to go out and they want her to watch her baby. How old do you think her character is supposed to be in this film?
Supposed to be 16 or 15.
Yeah, okay, 16 or 15. They're coming back at midnight.
Yeah.
I don't think I stayed up till midnight when I was 15. Maybe I did. Maybe
that's true. That's true. And like you, I felt like just the way the baby was handled, and she's yelling at the baby and stuff. And I thought, I know it's make believe and everything, but it's like, she's really holding that baby and kind of shaking him around and saying these mean things to him and stuff. Yeah, I thought, I don't know.
There's a scene later where the Goblin King is tossing him up in the air, and they CGI a little bit. He tosses him up in the air and then walks away, and one of the other, the baby comes hurtling back down, and one of the other goblins catches him.
Yeah,
it's kind of like, oh, easy with the baby, guy.
Yeah,
like the baby didn't do anything.
I thought so Jennifer Connelly is fine. She kind of has to carry the movie, I guess. I thought Bowie did a good job. One thing that was making me laugh all through it is, have you seen the Flight of the Conchords Bowie thing?
No.
Oh, okay. You have to watch that after watching this movie. Because just all through it, I'm just thinking of that sketch of them. It's a really great episode, but they're dressed up as different eras of Bowie, and they have a Goblin King, and it's just like they did a great job, recreating that. He's good in it. I think, as you said, I totally agree with it gets better as it goes along, and towards I'd say the last 20 minutes or so, if the entire film had been at the level of that, like the where they're walking around in the MC Escher thing, on the stairs and everything. And that was about the only part of the movie that really stuck with me, that I remembered as a kid. That's really well done. The Bowie songs are pretty bad. I didn't think they were, I texted you and said, this is not Bowie's best work. yeah, the songs are not great. And then the other thing is, I think it's a little cringy, especially towards the end, where she's 16 and he's a goblin king, so who knows what his age is, but Bowie was like 40 years old, and he's talking about how, if you'll love me, I'll be your slave and all this stuff. And it's like, that's a little,
Yeah.
that came off a little gross to me. And he's wearing like
Yeah.
basically like yoga pants, and you could kind of see a bulge and stuff. You know what I mean? It was just like,
Kinda.
yeah.
I think that one of the interesting things to me about this too is that I feel like it is made for younger kids than 16, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of thinking ahead. They're maybe 9, 10, 11, 12, thinking ahead to when they'll be 16 and have to babysit their little brother. And I think it's shot from the perspective of, this is a girl at 16 who is going through puberty, who is into fantasy, high fantasy stuff, and sort of through that lens of, oh, the handsome goblin king, and not really processing the like, well, he's 40 and that's creepy. And the whole thing is not, there's a bunch of, I mean, you're the psychology graduate, but there's a bunch of sort of, they go to the concepts of love are relatively unrefined. There's no sex or anything that really even approaches carnal love in this. It's all sort of storybook, fairy tale, happily ever after, we'll marry and you'll spend your life with me kind of thing. They go to the swamp of stench, which is pretty scatological in its humor, and so it paints the sort of themes as she navigates this labyrinth, which I took to be the sort of labyrinth of adolescence, or that stage of adolescence. It paints with some pretty broad brushes that I think is interesting. I would have liked all of that somehow to come into focus a little more. Like, there were some scenes that seemed to exist because they had a great design concept, and there's a scene in which there's a bunch of sort of, puppets, boogly wooglies, that keep taking their heads off and they're doing a dance, and it's a different kind of puppet than we've seen yet in the movie. And I'm still not really sure what that scene was about. I wasn't sure what they were supposed to represent. It kind of goes on and on. It's a song and sort of a nonsense song. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then there were other parts of it dealt like with friendship, and the Goblin King wants is he a troll or is he a dwarf, or what kind of creature is Hob Nort or whatever his name is?
I kind of took him as like a troll, but I don't know.
Gives him a peach or something. It says, here, you have to give this to her. And he suspects that it's poisoned or is going to do something bad to her, but he's afraid, and he ends up giving her and makes her forget everything. And so it explores this idea of what is it to be a friend, and forming a friendship, and feeling worthy of a friendship, and forgiveness and stuff at that sort of early to mid development stage. I just the whole thing didn't quite gel in that sense for me, in there. It's an adventure story. It's not a story that you're supposed to be teaching a lot of lessons from. I don't know. I'm realizing that this is sort of a muddy thought, but some of the scenes seemed more about the design and the visual than they did about whatever relationships were happening in the film. And that's why I think overall it seemed to drag a little bit. Like, it's very important. Now we're going to do this scene with this type of puppet. And then you go, okay, but did that scene need to be 6 minutes? Like, nothing, everything just kind of comes to a halt where we have this musical number about, and what is she feeling in this? And on screen, she doesn't seem to know. But the scenes in which you know, the stuff between her and Bowie is actually good. The stuff between her and another character where she's actually communicating, you know, with another character and they're sharing their feelings. I think those things are good and they get better. They might have shot roughly in sequence because the beginning of the film feels pretty stiff. But once she's in the labyrinth and starting to learn, like, oh, I can get through this if I, you know, rely on my friends and that's what's important and stuff, then I think that Jennifer Connelly is a good actress. You
Oh,
know,
sure.
camera loves her. Um, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. I'm rambling, but
Yeah, you know, it's hard to say if there was any uh symbolism in all of this. I mean, I just kind of took it more as this is a kids movie, you know. And like you said, we want to do some cool designs and some cool sets and things like that. And this is definitely, this is where I kept kind of thinking. I saw an interview with George Lucas the other day, just randomly, like on TikTok or Instagram or something like that. And he was talking about people being mad about the prequels and because they weren't dark enough, you know, that people want everything to be dark. And he's like, these are kids' movies. And he's like, you know, the originals were kids' movies too. But, you know, I can watch the Star Wars movies now and not feel like, oh, this is for little children, you know, whereas this, again, I felt like, you know, you talked about the, what is it called? The swamp of stench or whatever,
yeah,
where
the
it's,
final stench
yeah, it literally farts, you
the
know.
whole time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's farting the whole time. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that appeals to 6-year-olds or 8-year-olds or maybe 10-year-olds
And I
or whatever.
actually thought there was some scary stuff in this that it might frighten a 6-year-old. Like at one point, there's a thing called the cleaner or something, and it's a huge, they're in sort of a circular hallway tunnel, and this thing fills the entire tunnel, and it's a series of concentric inner, you know, it turns out that it's a cone, but there's lots of scary, sharp, nasty looking rotating blades on it, and there's nowhere for them to go. And at the last second, they manage to break through a door and get out of the way. And then you get this really neat reverse shot when you're with them and you see the thing go by, and there's a couple of weird little guys like on a big bicycle, and it's really whimsical and interesting once the thing goes by. But as it's bearing down on them, that's a scary scene, I thought.
And later on, there's a big knight with an axe that has some kind of little
I
creature,
remember
you know.
that. That's really cool.
Yeah, that was cool, you know. So there's a lot of neat set pieces in this. The thing that I always wonder about movies from our youth that were for children, what kids today would think of of this movie in particular. And for whatever reason, I think I don't know if it was off, if it was when we were recording last week or afterward, but for whatever reason, Labyrinth became a big hot topic thing, kind of like The Nightmare Before Christmas, where, you know, they sold shirts and, you know, all kinds of Labyrinth stuff in I don't know if they're still doing that anymore, but for whatever reason, you know, a generation that, you know, came along well after this movie was originally released and embraced it. So, you know, it has a pretty big cult following, but I don't think that's like little kids. I think that's teenagers and maybe even college age kids getting into it. And I talked to a couple of people just that I know online before watching this, or before recording, and they said, "Oh, I love Labyrinth." You know, people like around our age. Oh, I love, you know, and I've watched it, you know, dozens of times or whatever. So, I just wonder if, you know, a 10-year-old watched this now, what they would think of it. If this would be too slow to them, or if you know, if the Muppets would feel real to them, or what, you know?
I don't know. I do think that if you saw this movie without having grown up on Sesame Street and grown up on the Muppet Show and Fraggle Rock, this would have felt incredibly revolutionarily original, right?
Mhm.
I just, at the time I saw it, I was so like, I'd seen everything Henson Studios had done. You know what I mean? I couldn't wait for more of it. So at this point, I feel like I couldn't kind of unsee the Henson of it.
Right.
And Frank Oz, the two of them were they're geniuses, and the two of them working together, they've got their own rhythm and sense of comedy, and that's all in here too. Um, but I can totally see how a generation of people might sort of stumble across this and really latch onto it for all the things that make it great. I mean, I certainly don't want to get into a mode where it sounds like I'm bad mouthing this movie. I'm really glad we watched it and revisited it.
Mhm.
The only criticism I have, and if you're judging movies on how entertaining they are, it's a pretty significant criticism, is that I think as an adult, it dragged. It would be interesting, as you ask, if a kid today thinks it drags. My
Mhm.
hunch is, unless they're a very little kid, that they might, because
Yeah.
Disney, I mean, there are lots of examples of companies making kids movies now. I mean, you can say, "Oh, I don't like Frozen" or whatever, but there's a reason that Frozen, we must have watched Frozen 500 times
Mhm.
in my house when that came out, because my daughter couldn't get enough of it. And I have to admit that although I did get ultimately, I got very sick of seeing it again and again and again. It moves right along. You invest in the characters right away. There's just not any fat in that movie, you know? It
Mhm.
just keeps things driving forward, even when it's being silly, even when the musical number is a little detour from the main plot.
Mhm.
Um, so, I mean, I don't know. I think there are lots of very popular, readily available, right? Because they're streaming now too. You didn't have to go out and rent your stuff. You can just dial it up anytime you want. I
Right.
think the kids today might think, like I do, that this gets a little lost in the labyrinth.
Yeah. One thing that I would say about this is, you know, these, other than, they've tried to resurrect the Muppets a million times, and I think they're doing another one, but other than that, so I'm sure kids now even are very familiar with the Muppets, and Sesame Street is still around and all that. But other than that, we you don't get kids entertainment that's like this. They did the sequel or reboot or whatever of the Dark Crystal, the show that was for Netflix. And did you watch any of that?
No.
And I remember being somewhat excited by the trailer, and then I never watched it. Which I heard, I talked to a couple of people who said, yeah, they watched it and it was just too much for children. Like they didn't, I think they kind of thought it was going to be trying to appeal to the people our age who saw it, originally and grew up with it. But you just don't really get this kind of, uh, fantasy with puppets in this way that you know
Right.
what with Henson, you never felt like, um and he didn't work on Yoda, that was Frank Oz, but other than Yoda, um you never really felt like with the Muppets that they were trying to go with realistic, like photorealistic characters. That was part of
Right.
the fun or the magic or whatever of something like Labyrinth or the Dark Crystal, is you never felt like they were trying to say like, okay, we want this to look like this is a real
Right.
thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think one of the techniques that made Yoda a little different was certainly in Empire Strikes Back. They had a number of different Yoda puppets. It wasn't just a single puppet. So
Yeah.
he was looking, the scene where he says, where he is being playful, is a different facial puppet, still moving, but the puppet architecture has a certain mood already baked into it. And later when he goes, I'm not afraid, he goes, oh, you will be, that's a different puppet. So I think they were trying to achieve something that made the puppet seem more organic. And in this one, one thing I'll say about Labyrinth is they really did push the envelope in terms of what is a puppet, right? Some of them are sort of multi-person, almost marionette stick puppets. Some of them, like the troll we were talking about, is a person wearing a kind of, it can't be animatronic, can it? But some of it is, like the eyes turn and when he talks and the mouth is sort of moving, but it still feels, it's not quite like, it still feels, it's a misuse of the term, but there's this kind of uncanny valley between it being a pure puppet and going with it, or being pure CGI and going with it, or not, and it being a puppet that a person is wearing, right? So his hands are very expressive in a completely organic way, and the face is remarkably expressive for a puppet. I couldn't stop looking at the mechanism, right? I didn't really see a performance as much as I saw a puppeteer at work with the mechanism. And I mean, again, I think nobody else does work like this, but ultimately you're trying to hit a mark that what they do with Yoda works in Empire Strikes Back, and what they do with this character in this one doesn't quite. Little knight that's a little dog with an eye patch, or he's a fox or something.
I like him, yeah. And he's
pure puppet.
And he's riding on a dog.
Yeah, and you just go with it, right? But they've got everything between. They've got the giant knight that has to be, a multi-person mechanism. And then it turns out when they knock the head off, that thing is actually a puppet, and there's a little guy sitting in it, like, working these levers.
I really liked that.
It was brilliant. So it's a puppet within a puppet. And then there are goblins that are like riding these, I guess they're little dragons. They look a little sort of like half bird, half dragon, but in other words, it's a little person wearing an outfit that's got false legs, right? So the legs of the mount are the legs of the person, but it's brilliantly done. And it's like, literally there are little finger puppet sized puppets all the way up to this giant thing that is supposedly 20 feet tall, and it looks like they built it to scale.
Yeah.
And they had multiple people, like it's supposed to be clanky and slow. And I think I'm getting ahead of myself, but I absolutely recommend this movie on the visual spectacle of it alone. It's not that it's, that it's not really a caveat. It's not the most entertaining film we've seen. But I think it deserves a place in this kind of beloved, Hall of Fame, certainly for this kind of fantasy puppetry stuff. None of it is CGI. It's all practical and models and everything. And early on when she's exploring the labyrinth, it doesn't look like there's any doors. And it turns out that there is a door, but it's just an optical illusion that the bricks on the hallway behind line up perfectly with the bricks. That was so cool. And there's another part where you come around and there's some boulders, and the boulders look like Bowie's face. And then as you keep walking past them, the illusion you see that it's a series of boulders in the stack, that only if you look at them in that certain way do they make his face, and otherwise you lose the illusion. And she falls down a pit at one point, and there's all these sort of hands coming out of the stone that kind of arrest her fall and say, oh, we're helping hands. And the hands come together to form lots of different faces. It's the coolest effect. And she,
yeah. All those different faces. Yeah, I loved that. That was so creative.
Creative. And then
just using hands,
And then there's door knockers. There's two doors, and one of the door knockers has the knocker through its ears, and the other one is holding it in its mouth. And of course, it's the one through its ears. I can't hear you. The other one, oh, I mean,
Yeah, that was a great one.
there's so much creativity on show here, and I think that when the movie stumbles a little bit is when it prioritizes that over the storytelling of like, okay, well, what is our character feeling now and going through, and what are they driving for, and what's the motivation? You have to keep the story driving forward and afloat, and sometimes
Yeah,
it just takes a little backwater detour.
I think you could definitely say it's kind of style over substance in terms of there's not a whole lot of story really to this, you know. Um, this makes me, you know, now that we've been talking about this makes me kind of want to try the Dark Crystal show, because I know when they were working on that they swore they were going to use as little CGI as possible, because people were, I think, you know, people were saying like, oh, you're just going to make everything CGI. And they said, oh no, you know, it's going to be puppets, and you know, we're going to use CGI to remove strings, and you know, so you can't see the puppeteers and all that kind of stuff. So I wonder how much of that they did, but uh you know, the thing that's cool about watching this is the fantasy stuff that we get now. It all kind of looks the same. Like, I don't know if you seen the trailer for the Dungeons and Dragons movie?
Yes.
It just looks like Game of Thrones, right? You know, or Lord of the Rings, or you know,
The only thing that seems fresh to that about me actually is and it's a trailer, so you're not sure, but the
sure,
casting, they've decided to go with A-list cast.
yeah,
Unusual for a Dungeons and Dragons kind of thing, but I think that Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings might have made fantasy a little more palatable to A-list.
sure,
And it seems genuinely funny. I mean,
yeah,
that they're one of the pitfalls of fantasy is that it's deadly serious,
right.
and you're like, well, look, if it's not gonna be fun, and so this one seems like it's got a lot of humor in it,
Mm-hmm.
that at least in the trailer look.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I figure with Chris Pine, you're
Yeah,
probably going. He's being Chris Pine, you know, kind of what we've, you know, Captain Kirk and the guy from Wonder Woman and all that. But just in terms of aesthetically, to me, you know, all the fantasy stuff that we're getting, it just looks like it could all be shot by the same people and animated by, you know what I mean? Where it's like you're with Labyrinth, you're getting a very, now you could say, oh, this was all the, you know, the same kind of stuff that Henson was doing, but just compared to what we get now, we don't get fantasy stuff that looks anything like this at all.
right.
You know, if this were a brand new, you know, independent from Jim Henson, if they just said we're going to you know, we're going to remake Labyrinth, these sets would all be CGI. A lot of the characters would be CGI, right. You know.
Yeah, and you know, we've seen Benicio Guillermo,
and I was just gonna say, I don't mean to interrupt you, but he's about Guillermo del Toro. When you look at the, say, like the Hellboy movies, you know, he's one of the only directors that I think is doing anything kind of remotely like this, where he is using as much practical characters in his films as he can.
And I almost feel like that his design, his monster aesthetic, whether or not it owes anything to Henson, it's certainly it's evocative of Henson to me, and part of it
Yeah,
practical.
I'm sure
but
he was
also
heavily influenced by Henson, you know.
scale, and yeah, I mean, it's really remarkable. And then I think, you know, from the 80s, Tim Burton had a very distinct look.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
you know, there aren't a whole bunch of people that you can hold up and say this person. I mean, you can say the directors are visionary. I think George Lucas he had a vision that was enormous in scope. But in terms of this fantasy realm of monsters and goblins. And you're right, the Tolkien stuff stays pretty close to the original design and the illustrations on the book. Del Toro was lined up to do
The Hobbit,
and before
Peter Jackson came back. Yeah.
And I remember that he wanted to do something really interesting, for example, with the design of Smaug. Like he wanted it, I might be misremembering this, but he wanted it to imagine when he was flying like a hatchet, like when you throw a hatchet, that he somehow has this totally crazy way of hurling through the air when he flies. And I think the studio was kind of like, I think we need to, as conservative as fantasy can get, I think we need to stick with the universe Jackson created here that looks and feels like the books. And I don't know how much of that conversation had to do with them waiting or paying more money or what to get Peter Jackson back associated with the project.
Right.
But I think the studio very much wanted more of the same visually.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. And it paid off for them because, even the Hobbit movies, even though, people don't seem to like them as much as the Lord of the Rings movies, they still made a ton of money. I think,
Then they're good, and you can go back and look at them. And he created this, world of Middle Earth on screen, and everybody hands in a good performance. I think the big thing is that the Lord of the Rings, each was a huge novel that he made a single film out of, and The Hobbit is a slender little children's volume. It's not a big book, and they stretched it into 3 movies. And even if you took these, and I know, of course, I know why they did it. They wanted 3 more years of epic holiday releases, but they are long, and there's a lot in there that I think sort of drags. And even if you edited those 3 films down to 2 films, I think it would be more compelling.
Yeah. With Del Toro, he did Pan's Labyrinth, but I would love to, which I loved, but wouldn't it be great for him to do just a straight fantasy film, a Dungeons and Dragons-esque kind of a thing? If he'd just have free reign that could be really amazing.
That could be really amazing. One of the things that I'm kind of interested, my daughter is very into D&D now, just got into it, and I'm super excited because I don't still play D&D, but I really enjoyed it when I was a kid. I would. Mostly it's about time.
Sure, yeah, we played. We used to play.
And one of the things I really like about this is there's a druid character that turns into an owlbear. Like, it goes into the monster manual, and it's pulling these classic monsters out. I love that, because if you're going to call it Dungeons and Dragons, then let's see the property.
Have you shown her the cartoon?
No.
I don't know if it's like how it holds up now, but
I don't remember the cartoon very well.
I was really, really into it.
I think until Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, I didn't feel like I had seen swords and sorcery on screen that felt as satisfying to watch as my imagination did just playing the game and reading the monster manual and and looking at fan art and part of it was just the costumes and the sets didn't look believable, and then he came along and put the time and energy and the detail work into it where you really fell in love with these. Can I understand that Lord of the Rings is not Dungeons and Dragons, but no Tolkien, no Dungeons and Dragons. What I mean?
Right.
And so just the detail work on the elvish armor and like everything was so invested in that you were, and shooting in New Zealand, you're like, well, that feels like fantasy land, crazy mountains and epic valleys, and it really looked like a fantasy landscape. I mean, it is kind of a fantasy. I've been to New Zealand. It's gorgeous.
Oh, cool. I didn't know you'd been there.
And it's really got a lot of everything. It's got the forest. I mean, for a relatively small 2 islands, it's remarkable how many different topographies there are there. But
Mhm.
anyway, Labyrinth. So, um, would you recommend this also?
I think I would probably do a thumb sideways. I think, you have the people who, I guess you have the people who are, let me say this. I didn't really have any nostalgic attachment to this other than it just loving Jim Henson. Um, but like I say, I'd never really felt any need over the years to revisit this. I'm glad we watched it to because I thought, because I didn't love it the initial time seeing it, and I thought, maybe now it'd be one of those things where looking at it, through different eyes, I'll view it differently. Um I don't think I realized it was as much of a kids movie when I was a kid. Um I think at the time I just thought it was just kind of weird, and I hadn't really. You kind of articulated something I that I that I didn't really know how to put into words, I guess, where you said that you you loved the Muppets and those characters, and when you would see these films, you wanted to see those characters again, and you got sort of versions of those characters, but not exactly. And I think maybe that's how I felt about these things like the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and other fantasy stuff that Henson worked on at the time. Um, so I guess where I would say sideways is now for people who have not seen this before, I don't know who exactly this would be for. Um, I I I can imagine just a lot of people our age, if you said like, "Hey, you're into Lord of the Rings or whatever, have you ever seen Labyrinth?" No. And if they just watched it as an adult, I think there would be a lot of people just be like, "Oh, this is a children's movie." Um, but people who would be really appreciative of the stuff that we've mentioned, the set design and the characters and all that. If you have not seen this before, I think it's worth watching for all of that.
Yeah.
Um, I felt exactly the same way as you, where like early on I felt like this is kind of a slog, but it definitely picks up, kind of in the third act, I guess I would say. And I guess one of the complaints I maybe had with it is I could have used more Bowie, you know. Although he doesn't really have a whole lot to do, he spins those glass balls around,
Yeah.
But I think if the entire film had been as enjoyable to me as the last half hour was, I would say this is a great um, kind of fantasy kids movie.
Yeah.
But taking it as a whole, it's pretty good. I guess I would say.
Yeah.
Again, it kept making me, even though they're not exactly the same kind of aesthetic, it really made me think of Time Bandits a lot more, which Time Bandits is, a little older audience that it would skew towards. But yeah, it just I guess maybe just a little more editing just to kind of shorten some of those long scenes. I would have been more into it.
Well, you mentioned Bowie too. He has they have a scene together at the end, right before she gets her brother back. And he sort of, because all through the movie, I'm like, what is this character about? Like, what is he? He seems to want the thing. And in her recital, it's like, oh, the Goblin King wants to marry her, wants her as his bride or partner,
Mm-hmm.
in his kingdom. But that doesn't seem clear throughout the movie. And at the end, he has a monologue to her. Well, not monologue. He's speaking to her, and he has a speech. I almost want to go back and rewatch it, where he's like, he's sort of saying, she says you're not making it easy, or you're not being very cooperative, or something like that. And he said, "What are you talking about? Like, that's all I've done." And the what I took from that speech was kind of like, I'm being I'm being the Goblin King, right? I'm a figment of your imagination. I'm being this contradictory character you wanted of me, that you wanted me to be, right? I'm cruel just like you wanted, and unyielding just like you wanted. And the way that he phrases it is kind of like, all I really am is just this figment of your romantic teenage imagination of what you want. They're in the bubble, right? She's forgotten, they're in the bubble, and she's got a big hairpiece wig on, and she's gorgeous, and with the big puffy shoulders, and it's like a ball, and he's there, and it's very confusing. And his performance, that is nothing so much as like, kept waiting on her to sort of make the play, when of course she's the teenage girl, so she's waiting on the guy to make the play, sweep her off her feet or kiss her or whatever. And he seems like a teenage boy would be waiting on a cue from her somehow, because he doesn't know what to do. And I think that in the hands of maybe a different actor and a little more in-depth conversation, because Bowie is not a bad actor, but it's not his first skill.
No.
We could have seen that character really be the other, because she carries the movie, but it is the tension between those two. He's on the poster, and I think that character is part of what makes the movie feel like some of the air is out of it, because that it never really delivers on. You don't have a moment where you go, oh, or you see from the beginning, oh, I see what this whole thing is kind of, is Wizard of Oz, and this is maybe she dozed off and she's dreamed the whole thing, or but this is all really her mind.
Yeah.
She gets to the end, she says, "You have no power over me." She remembers the line, so there's a part of the architecture of this film that, like, it all kind of comes back around to the end, except it doesn't feel satisfying in that way. You're like, so was that supposed to be like a call, but tying it all off somehow? Because I didn't,
Yeah.
I still thumbs up it, as long as you know what you're getting into. I mean, if you think this is going to be, super entertaining as an adult without any nostalgia factor. Like, if you're like me, that I saw it as a kid, and it seems there's a lot of, Labyrinth keeps popping up. Like, yeah, you should totally check it out again. On the visuals alone, it's really something.
Yeah.
I think the whole thing doesn't quite gel in the way that I imagine it aspired to. I guess.
Yeah.
I felt like it was going for something it didn't quite deliver on. But in terms of the visuals, man, never seen anything like it. I mean, even Pan's Labyrinth, which is incredible, feels like it borrows some stuff from this.
I'm sure, yeah. And I mean, they're just the imagination, that went into it.
Yeah.
For sure, it's worth.
Pan's Labyrinth is not a kid's movie. Actually,
no, not at all.
That movie scared the hell out of me. It was great.
Oh yeah. I love Pan's Labyrinth. Regarding Bowie, when we get off of here, I'm going to send you the Flight of the Conchords thing. And anybody who is a fan of Labyrinth or a fan of David Bowie or whatever, if you have not seen, just go on YouTube and look for Flight of the Conchords Bowie.
We should link to it. We should link to it in the comments or something.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I will put a link when we post this on YouTube. I will put a link to the Flight of the Conchords, because it's fantastic. All right. So we've already have discussed what we want to do next.
Yes. Are you still down with that?
To do the Prey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So folks, there's a new movie that's come out. It's called Prey. It's in the Predator franchise. We've both seen it. I won't tip our hands on it, but we thought since this
No,
is...
I have not seen it yet.
Oh, you haven't seen it yet?
No,
You already
no,
watched
I
it?
haven't watched it yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a brand new thing. So, and we are going to talk about it. So if you haven't gotten to it yet and you don't want us to spoil it, be aware that we're going to do Prey, and then we're going to do Predator 2. We're not going to do Predator 1, although it fits right in the wheelhouse of this thing too. But I think Danny Glover, when you mentioned that, I was like, yeah, because, I remember thinking Predator 2 was good. It's urban. They didn't have Schwarzenegger. But I remember thinking it was pretty good, but I haven't seen it since it came out. So we're going to do Prey, and then we're going to do Predator 2.
And a couple of things with that. I haven't checked on where you can watch Predator 2, but Prey is it's only on Hulu. So, and I was actually listening to some stuff about it. And I'll just say this real briefly. We can talk more about this when we actually do the episode, but it was, it's the biggest thing that Hulu has had.
Wow.
In terms of movies and, and they've had some pretty big things, original, The Handmaid's Tale and, some other things, but people have said it's, had a really great reception, and people have said, well, why was this not a theatrical release? But I think it was just one of those things where, the last one didn't do so great, the Predator or whatever it was. And, I think that one was kind of a bomb. And so I think
I feel like I saw somebody on Facebook saying they were going to see Prey in the theater. Did it have no theatrical release whatsoever?
As far as I know, this was strictly Hulu. But I could be wrong. I was wrong about George Lucas and Labyrinth, so I could be totally.
Man,
maybe they did a tiny
every time I was wrong on this podcast. I say things like I'm certain of it, and then it literally will sign off the following morning. I'm like, oh, I was 100% wrong about that.
So yeah, I don't know about theatrical.
Or did we just fall silent there for a second?
I think we just fell silent.
Interesting. Prey director opens up on movie releasing on Hulu and not in theaters. Huh.
Yeah, that was my understanding, that they did not do any theatrical thing with it. But anyway, it's been a giant hit for Hulu. So we're probably going to see more Predator stuff, whether we want it or not,
Right.
But yeah, so, and then with Predator 2, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've seen the original Predator a bunch of times. So, it's not really, I would rather watch a Predator movie that I don't remember as well. So.
Right. Well, I hear you. And that's our next two. And then we've already even had some conversation about what's down the road from there, but we're going to keep that close to our chest because let's just stick with the next two.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have anything else that you want to add before? Oh, Chris and Chris Talk Movies @gmail.com. That's our handle. We are on YouTube. We're on podcasts. Thank you for listening.
Instagram and Twitter and all that kind of stuff.
Socials. Like and subscribe. Leave us a comment, please. Thank you. It's so great to have you listening. Okay. Now, is there anything else you want to add?
I don't think so.
Then we will talk to you next week.